Good morning. I'm Eve Arbogast, one of Max's daughters.
And I'm Jessie Arbogast, and we are both here to celebrate today with Max.
We're going to do a reading from It Matters What We Believe by Sophia L. Fahs.
Some beliefs are like walled gardens. They encourage exclusiveness and the feeling of being especially privileged.
Other beliefs are expansive and lead the way into wider and deeper sympathies.
Some beliefs are like shadows, clouding children's days and fears of unknown calamities.
Other beliefs are like sunshine, blessing children with the warmth of happiness.
Some beliefs are divisive, separating saved from unsaved, friends from enemies.
Other beliefs are bonds in a world community where sincere differences beautify the pattern.
Some beliefs are like blinders, shutting off the power to choose one's own decisions.
Other beliefs are like gateways opening wide vistas for exploration.
Some beliefs weaken a person's selfhood. They blight the growth of resourcefulness.
Other beliefs nurture self-confidence and enrich the feeling of personal worth.
Some beliefs are rigid, like the body of death, impotent in a changing world.
Other beliefs are pliable, like young sapling ever growing with the upward thrust of life. Thank you.
Wow, can you imagine Mark Twain is here this morning? An honor it is to be invited here to speak to you, my fellow UUs, to speak from this free pulpit on the eve of America's birthday.
Speaking of speaking, here's what American humorist Mark Twain said about speaking. There's nothing in the world as persuasive, like persuasive speech to fuddle the mental apparatus. So I hope Max will avoid motivational rhetoric.
Thank you, Mark Twain, for that caveat. I hear you. Like many of us, I come to church thirsty and hungry. Thirsty for fellowship, hungry for hope. In this precarious chapter of our nation's history, I'll do my best to air out the American soul, but I cannot honestly offer us blessed assurance. I can only urge us all to be kind, to wear a mask, and to please vote. That I am allowed to speak my beliefs about America this morning without getting arrested means we still enjoy freedom of speech. In America, we don't have to worry about some authoritarian thug trying to poison or kill us. We can still write letters to the editor, criticizing leaders and not fear disappearing. However, I remember well being thrown into a New York City jail in 1965 for protesting America's policy in Vietnam, where we were killing teenagers loyal to Ho Chi Minh, who in my view held the higher moral hill. Just as there are good and bad kinds of cholesterol, there are good and bad kinds of ego, and there's good and bad kinds of government policies. The same holds true for beliefs. It matters what you believe. You must believe, wrote the poet Oliver Wendell Holmes to his son, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote his father back, "Father, I no longer believe in belief." Oh, that made him furious. How dare you talk to your father like that? The conservative hero Edmund Burke famously said, "My country, right or wrong?" But that was only the first half. The second half went, "Right, I'll defend it. Wrong, I'll correct it." Why do we neglect to quote that second part? That's what makes a good citizen. John F. Kennedy said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Excuse me, I'm a little nervous up here. A recent Washington Post crossword puzzle clue was sermon topic, 3 letters. The answer was S-I-N, sin. Now, we rule-following inhabitants of the Unitarian universe supposedly believe in original goodness, not original sin. But when we face it, chief among America's sins as a nation was our taking of this land, which used to be lived upon by various indigenous populations of tribes and nations. My longtime friend, Peter Nabokov, phrased it a holocaust of murder, disease, and loss. While that was being accomplished, we, the people, installed a system that depended on slavery as an economic engine. Our union, which Abe Lincoln achieved at such a terrible cost, excluded blacks from educational and economic opportunities. And one of my favorite folk singers, Leadbelly, he moved to Washington with his wife, Martha. Me and Martha were standing on the stairs. I heard a white man say, don't want no colored up there. It's a bourgeois town. It's a bourgeois town. Tell all your friends, home of the brave, boom, boom, land of the free. Tell all your friends to stay away from Washington, D.C. It's a bourgeois town. Although white men in power eventually begrudgingly allowed populations typically excluded from the democratic process. I lifted that phrase from the keynote speaker at Eli's graduation. Like African Americans, populations typically excluded from the democratic process, like African Americans, and later, even women got the right to vote. They're still trying to suppress black voting and keep women from deciding matters concerning their own bodies. Well, I wrote that well before last week. During World War II, we sent Japanese American citizens to internment camps. Exclusive would be the adjective more apt than exceptional to describe America. And oh yeah, the United States is obsessively, pathologically addicted to guns. Enough about sins. Jasmine Kaur, who's now turned 9, but was 8 years old when, and a 3rd grader in Porterfield Elementary School, and I have the honor of tutoring her 1 hour a week every Thursday. Jasmine family gave me permission to use their names. They're from Punjab, India, where many girls learn to cook, but most do not receive much education past elementary school.
Well, about learning, Mark Twain said, a full belly is of little worth where the mind is starved.
In India, Jasmine's mom was not permitted to walk a few houses down the street to play with her friend, unless she was accompanied by a male relative, and she had to use the side door of her own home while her brothers were allowed to use the front door. Hardly any English is spoken in their house, a low-income apartment complex in Glen Burnie, Maryland. Jasmine's granddaddy speaks only Punjabi. During a tutoring session on Lincoln's birthday in February, I said, Jasmine, I've been asked to give a sermon on America at the church, and I need some help. What do you think when you think America? Could you help me out? I asked her, what pops in your mind when you think about America? Jasmine, being an optimist, said, I believe America to be a good place where we have justice, where there's a lot of opportunity to go to college, where there are no racist police. She was 8 years old in the 3rd grade when she said that. The America Jasmine believes in is the country I want to be a citizen of, a place where there's equal education for girls and boys and equal opportunities and choices for women and men. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln said, "Arguments based in the idea that some people are not capable of making their own decisions are the arguments that kings have made for enslaving the people in all ages of the world." Lincoln also said, "I should like to know if taking this old Declaration of Independence, which declares that all men are equal upon principle, and making exceptions to it, where will it stop? If that declaration is not the truth, let us get the statute book in which we find it and tear it out." Although I'm glad Jasmine is still hopeful and optimistic about America, I am rather conflicted and worried about America today. Stephen Colbert said, "America is essentially an optimistic country. That's the nature. We're all just tired." I look for reasons to be optimistic. Maybe Mr. Twain has some thoughts on optimism.
Optimist is just another word for daydreamer, more elegantly spelled. It's better to be an optimist who is sometimes wrong than a pessimist who is always right. There is no sadder sight than a young pessimist, except perhaps an old optimist. That optimist of yours is always ready to turn hell's backyard into a playground.
My country, right or wrong? Wrong America manifested itself in segregated schools, lynching, inequitable distribution of wealth, and obscenely bloated military programs labeled black ops, which are shrouded in such secrecy that ordinary citizens are prohibited from knowing what the program does or how much it costs. Congress just approved an astronomical $750 billion Pentagon budget. So much secrecy allows too much room for mischief and no way for accountability. The American eagle flies on payday. Talk about hell's backyard. I believe that constantly declaring ourselves exceptional is obnoxious arrogance. And the United States is not the only America, and we're not always number one. America. Our Spanish teacher said, you shouldn't, when you go down to Mexico or Costa Rica or someplace, and where you're from, you say, "I'm American." Say, Estados Unidos. That means the United States. Make it clear. America also comprises Mexico, El Salvador, Ecuador, more. Purple mountains in Ecuador or China are equally majestic to our own. Great and wise ideas have been expressed in every country's culture and language.
Travel is fatal to prejudice, I say.
Travel is fatal to prejudice. Autocratic nations monitor, censor, shut down, and police their citizens' internet activity. Not too long ago, it seemed possible to believe in that exceptional idea about America, but now the internet has made us all citizens of the world. Once upon a long time ago, America got her news from the press. Now we all partake of the World Wide Web. We must vet our sources as we inform ourselves, otherwise we merely choose our news most congruent with our already held views. I'm about to give a kind of difficult quote from The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt. It's a little awkward, but the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, i.e., the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, i.e., the standards of thought, no longer exist. The distinctions no longer exist between true and false, fact and fiction. That's the person that we're having a lover's quarrel with. Christopher Hitchens, when he called a certain kind of dialectical honesty is required of us, that we accept fact, science, and the imperative expressed in our UU principles to seek the truth in love, to seek the truth with love. We're having a lover's quarrel. The right wing is having a lover's quarrel with the left wing. We have to remember not to drop love, not to let it fade away. 'Tis of the far left and the extreme right I sing. I am conflicted and anxious about the precarity of this great experiment we call democracy. Your takeaway from this sermon might be the word precarity. If the way we are mishandling COVID is any indication about our collective ability to resolve big problems, how will America deal with climate change? I want to find reasons to be hopeful for all the children and grandchildren, like Jasmine, and both Jacks, and Jem, and Jesse, and all the other ones whose names don't start with J. Also bright and beautiful, inheriting a world filled with conflict and wonder. Precarity. If we allow democracy to die, there will be no buffer like the First Amendment between us and the autocrats like Putin, warlords, gang leaders, whom the world observes killing protesters with impunity. Just as we need air, we need freedom, and we need laws, and we need to accept factual science and the imperative expressed in our UU principles to seek the truth in love. It is required of us to emulate Harry S. Truman, HST. The sign on his desk read, "The buck stops here." To Thomas Jefferson's injunction to follow truth, let us add courage to acknowledge the truth. When I have fears of being carried away down a river of despair for our country, I have to resort to remembering what makes me proud of our country, like the parents of Judge Ketanji Jackson Brown, beaming with pride at their daughter's confirmation hearing. Sometimes I have to recite names of fellow citizens I admire, telling them to myself like beads on a rosary. Harriet Tubman, Eleanor Roosevelt. Oh yeah, she makes me feel proud to be an American. Duke Ellington, James A.G., James Baldwin, Martin Luther King, RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Mrs. Evola S. Peters, George Gershwin, Aaron Copland, Nina Simone. Also transcendentalists like Emerson, Thoreau, who pronounced his name Thoreau, and W.H. Channon, who imbued our Unitarian faith in the innate goodness of humanity, and the pragmatists like Charles Peirce, who pronounced his name Peirce, the professor and inventor of modern statistics. He taught at Johns Hopkins. One of his students there, John Dewey, I learned from one of his students there, John Dewey, I learned to bear the burden of incertitude. I'm comfortable with a little uncertainty on my shoulders. His book, The Quest for Certainty, eschewed distinctions between appearance and reality, theory and practice, knowledge and action, fact and value, and instead tried to address the problems of men, by which he meant people. American pragmatism says, if it works okay, go ahead and use it. So I speak American English, I root for the nearby teams. Occasionally I write a letter to the editor. The buck stops here. Yes, there are at least two sides to almost everything. I offer no prescriptions for reconciliation between the opposing sides of our divided country. Fair and balanced, however, doesn't mean allowing patently false disinformation to be accorded equal time. We can choose to practice a certain kind of dialectical honesty with regard to climate science, COVID vaccine science, election evidence, and established fact. I'd like to posit that we still do hold certain truths to be self-evident. Facts matter. Truth matters. Black lives matter. Grandchildren matter. At some point, each one of us, being good pragmatists, must decide to stop the buck and grab the buck by the horns of its dilemma and wrestle it down to earth. Every moment, with every beat of our heart, truth begins anew in our mind's ear. If we try, we can hear it ringing. May it be so.